keep hearing that voter fraud is a myth. Okay, can you speak to that, please?
Sure. I mean, that is just not true. We have a database at the Heritage Foundation of proven cases. So these are cases actually investigated. People were prosecuted, convicted in a court of law, or a judge ordered a new election because of fraud. We've got 1,300 proven cases from around the country, and that's not a comprehensive list. It's just a sampling of cases. And the problem here is that many potential cases of fraud, nothing is done about them. Election officials don't send them to law enforcement. Law enforcement doesn't investigate them. And we know the potential cases out there is far, far larger than the proven cases we have in our database.
So are there any studies that actually explore that at all? Like what proportion of these, so what does the data say?
Well, the Public Interest Legal Foundation just released a report, and they did something that the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity wanted to do, but it got shut down by basically by the left before it could do that. The Public Interest Legal Foundation obtained voter registration lists from a majority of states. They obtained voter histories from a majority of states, and then they supplemented the data with commercial data to be sure they had the unique identity of each registered voter. Their report shows that in the 2016 and 2018 election, literally tens of thousands of individuals are credited by state election officials with voting after they were dead. Tens of thousands of individuals are registered in more than one state and voted in more than one state in the same election. They found tens of thousands of voters who are registered mistakenly more than once in the same state and took advantage of that by casting more than one ballot also in the same state. The total potential cases of fraud that they uncovered is over 140,000 cases just from the last two federal elections.
Okay, and so what is the impact of that? Let's say all those cases prove true. What would the impact of that have been on those elections?
Well, it depends on where you are. But remember, we have close elections all the time in this country, particularly at the local level, the local city council, town council, and county commission level. We have that in state legislative races. We sometimes even have it in federal elections. Don't forget, just 2 years ago, the 9th congressional district race in North Carolina was overturned. There was only a 900 vote margin in that race. 7 individuals were charged, criminally charged with tampering with absentee ballots, and the election was overturned and they had to hold a new election. So the fraud in North Carolina just 2 years ago affected a congressional seat.
No, I mean, that's incredible. And so the data that they looked at, so this data set, it's not, is it comprehensive or it's just indicative of something that could be a larger trend?
It's indicative of a larger trend. I mean, for example, one thing they did not look at is voting by non-citizens. It is a felony under state and federal law for an alien to register and or vote, and yet we know that also is going on all around the country. The U.S. Attorney in North Carolina just recently indicted 19 aliens for illegally registering and voting in elections there. And that's just a microcosm of the problem. This study did not even look at that potential issue. So non-citizen voting you can add on top of all the other cases that they found.
You know, something that was interesting, I was reading your article on this earlier, and there's this idea that you can register at your commercial address and then also vote at your residential address. And there's actually a Republican congressional member that was charged for this?
Yes, this summer in July, the representative from Kansas, Steve Watkins, was criminally charged because he registered at a UPS store and then voted in a municipal election. That's illegal. You have to register where you reside. You cannot register at a commercial address. But in fact, this study also turned up over 30,000 individuals around the country who are registered at commercial addresses, by the way, including several individuals who are registered at the western headquarters of NPR in Culver City, California.
Fascinating. Okay. Today, we're seeing all these, photos people are putting up on social media, someone receiving multiple ballots at their address for names that aren't there. How prevalent is this sort of thing, and how big of a threat is this sort of thing?
Unfortunately, it's very prevalent. Voter rolls around the country, the statewide voter registration lists, are notoriously bad shape. Election officials don't do a very good job of maintaining their accuracy. They're not good at taking people off after they've moved away or taking people off after they have died. And because of that, those states that have made the decision, I think an unwise decision, to simply mail out an absentee ballot to all registered voters are guaranteeing that ballots are going to arrive at people's homes for folks who don't live there anymore or for individuals who have died. And the potential is there for others to gather up those ballots and to try to vote them. And whether or not they'll pass election officials are going to depend on, well, how good are the election officials at detecting fraudulent ballots. Past history shows they're not very good at that.
So I remember a lot of discussion about the LA County voter roll and so forth. But what percentage across the country of voter rolls are erroneous? Is there any information on that?
No, there's not a lot of current information about that. The Los Angeles case you're talking about is Los Angeles agreed, I think about a year ago, in a lawsuit to take 1.5 million registered voters off of their list because these are people that turned out no longer lived in LA or had died, and yet Los Angeles had not taken them off. A little over 10 years ago, there was a case before the U.S. Supreme Court over Indiana's voter ID law. And in that case, the estimate was that as much as 40% of Indiana's voter registration list was inaccurate, people who should no longer be on the list.
It's remarkable, and frankly, with this LA County case, a lot of pressure was required, a lot of work was required to actually get them to do that. Why would they be so resistant to this? This is the thing that I was very confused about.
Well, part of the problem here is that for the last 30 years, really accelerating the last 10 years, progressive groups with a lot of money, the ACLU and other groups like that, they have filed lawsuits against election officials all over the country anytime they try to clean up their voter list, saying and making the false claim that they are trying to suppress votes. That's not true. But they spend so much money on trying to prevent this that, just 2 years ago, one of those cases out of Ohio made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was all because the ACLU and other groups simply wanted to prevent Ohio from trying to bring its voter registration list up to date.
Why would that benefit progressive groups to not purge the voter rolls?
Well, I frankly think, for example, they really want as many people voting as possible, even if they aren't eligible to vote. And the example I would give you of that is, look, we know there's a problem with non-citizens registering and voting and not being detected doing that. Yet anytime states have tried to put in provisions that would prevent that, for example, comparing their statewide lists with records of the Department of Homeland Security to find non-citizens, or when states like Kansas and Georgia have tried to put in a legal requirement saying you have to provide proof of citizenship when you register to vote. that has been opposed in lawsuits by the left. Well, why would they oppose that unless they want non-citizens registering and voting in elections, even though they know it's illegal?
No, that's interesting. So let's talk about this voter suppression briefly. So presumably it exists in some cases. What's the reality and what's the fiction here in your view?
Voter suppression, that is a made-up term by the left. They use it to oppose any efforts to increase the security, integrity of the election process. Probably the best example of that is voter ID laws. Voter ID laws have been in place in this country now for more than 10 years. They've been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. The turnout data after those laws went into effect in places like Georgia and Indiana show they don't suppress anyone's vote. And you still constantly hear that meme repeated in many media sources that voter ID is a way of suppressing votes, even though it's not true. It's simply a way of opposing reforms like voter ID, proof of citizenship, comparing statewide voter registration lists to find people who have moved. It's just a way of opposing anything like that will increase the integrity of the election process.
Yeah, the idea that having voters present ID is contentious is kind of bizarre to someone like me who's a Canadian, where that's required, from at least from what I understand. I don't know if things have changed. Or Taiwan, we were watching this the vibrant Taiwan democracy methodology. I'm sure you saw how that works. I thought it was pretty fascinating, but it's just something that doesn't quite compute, I think, for a lot of people. Maybe they don't realize around the world that this is the case.
No, I think it is bizarre. Western democracies, Canada, all of Europe, everybody requires an ID. South Africa requires an ID to vote. So does Mexico. Only in the United States is this looked upon and criticized as somehow a way of suppressing votes. What's interesting about this is that it's only the leadership of progressive groups and others that say that this is vote suppression. The polling actually shows that an overwhelming majority of Americans, regardless of their race and regardless of their party affiliation, all think having to show an ID when you vote is just a common sense ID, and they support it.
So there's been reports of vote by mail collection boxes being broken into. Are you aware of this?
Yes, and U.S. postal boxes were also broken into in Virginia over the weekend. So they put out a warning. State officials there. They put out a warning to anyone who may have put their absentee ballot in the mail in those boxes, and that is one of the problems with absentee or mail-in balloting using any kind of mailbox or drop box that is unmonitored and is not under 24-hour surveillance and security.
Is there any information about how much risk that actually creates?
There is information on the fact that if you vote by mail, you are far more likely to be disenfranchised than if you vote in person. About 8 years ago, the New York Times actually wrote an article about absentee balloting, and they said that statistics showed that the disenfranchisement rate was about double that of voting in person. And the reason for that is that it's everything from voters making mistakes when they provide the information that's required with an absentee ballot, to forgetting to sign the absentee ballot, to the Postal Service not delivering the ballots on time, in time enough to be counted, and also the Postal Service making a mistake and not actually postmarking the envelope with the absentee ballot, meaning that when election officials get it, they reject it because they don't know if you actually voted the ballot by the end of Election Day, which is one of the requirements for an absentee ballot to count. Because of all that, the rejection rate for absentee ballots is much higher than for ballots cast in person in a polling place.
Fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about ballot harvesting. You know, it's legal in California. I was actually talking with Congressman Devin Nunes about his riding and kind of how it changed the dynamics. Sorry, not riding, that's the Canadian term, his district. And he was talking about how it substantially changed the dynamics of how they had to function to, you know, get out the vote, so to speak. So I guess I wanted you to tell me briefly, how does it work in a legal context? What are the problems? And then how does it work when it's not legal?
Right. Look, you can vote by absentee ballot in American states. And in about half of the states, you can return that ballot by mailing it back, by you personally delivering it to election officials, or by a member of your family personally delivering it to election officials. But in about half the states, they have legalized what's called ballot or vote harvesting. That means they've made it legal for any third party, any stranger, to hand deliver your ballot. So that means that they have made it legal for candidates, campaign staffers, party activists, and political consultants to show up at your front door and offer to deliver your ballot. Now, that's an unwise policy because you're putting something very, very valuable, a valuable commodity, a ballot, into the hands of individuals who have a stake in the outcome of the election. And it also gives them the ability to tamper with the ballot. And we saw, again, just quickly going back to North Carolina 2 years ago, in fact, that election was overturned because North Carolina actually makes vote harvesting illegal. But a political consultant there and 6 of his staffers, all of whom have been criminally charged, were in fact going to individuals' homes, collecting their ballots, and in fact tampering with them, forging witness signatures, sometimes filling out the ballot instead of the voter filling it out. And that is why legalizing vote harvesting is just a very bad idea, and really states should not do that.
You know, but this is what's really interesting. It changes the dynamics in those states substantially because kind of everybody has to play the game, right?
Right, that's exactly right. If you're a candidate, you better have people out there knocking on the homes of voters and offering to pick up and return their ballot. Otherwise, you may lose the race. It's a bad dynamic to introduce into campaigns and elections.
Fascinating. Any final thoughts before we finish up?
No, just that I know everyone is saying we need to vote by mail because of COVID-19, but in fact, unless you are particularly in one of the groups that's susceptible to this, there's no reason you can't vote safely in person. You know, polling places are going to have the same precautions in place that our grocery stores and pharmacies are right now. And if you have line spacing and sanitation stations and masks, you should be able to vote safely in person and guarantee that your ballot is delivered into the ballot box.
Wonderful. It's such a pleasure to speak with you, Hans.
Thanks for having me.